For 28 years, Tori, lived a lie. My father, Gerald, constantly accused my mother of infidelity, using my blonde hair and blue eyes as proof. I believed I was his daughter, just different. Then came my engagement party, a night meant for celebration. Instead, Gerald grabbed the microphone, his eyes gleaming, ready to expose what he believed was my mother's ultimate betrayal, the results of a DNA test he'd forced me to take. What did it reveal? Not only was I not his daughter, but I wasn't my mother's either. Suddenly, 28 years of accusations, of silent suffering, of a life built on a lie, shattered in mere minutes, triggered by a single email. The real secret keeper, a retired head nurse, Margaret Sullivan, sat quietly in a diner booth, nervously stirring her coffee, completely unaware that the truth she'd guarded for decades was about to rewrite my entire past, present, and future. Before I do, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I like knowing who's out there. Now, let me take you back 6 weeks to the night my father issued his ultimatum. It was a Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Fairfield, Connecticut. A 6-bedroom Tudor-style home my father loved to remind us he'd earned with his own 2 hands. The dining room gleamed with restoration hardware furniture and Wedgwood china that my mother polished every week, as if perfection could somehow protect her from his accusations. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat at the far end of the table, her silver hair pinned back, watching my father the way a hawk watches a snake. My brother, Marcus, 31 and the golden child, kept his eyes on his plate. My mother, Diane, clutched her linen napkin like a lifeline, and then Gerald Townsend cleared his throat. "I won't be attending your wedding, Tori." The words landed like a grenade. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. "Gerald," she whispered, "please not tonight." But he was already reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded document and slid it across the oak table toward me. "I've thought about this for a long time," he said, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "I won't walk another man's daughter down the aisle. Not until we settle this once and for all." I looked at the paper. It was a consent form for a DNA paternity test from a local clinic. His name already signed at the bottom. "You have 6 weeks," Gerald continued. "Take the test. Make the results public to the family. If you're mine, I'll be there. I'll even apologize." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "But we both know what the test will show." My grandmother's teacup hit the saucer with a sharp crack. My mother started crying, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. And I sat there staring at my father's Rolex Submariner, glinting under the chandelier, thinking, 28 years. He's been building to this moment for 28 years. I didn't sign the paper that night. I didn't storm out either. I simply said, "Thank you for the reminder, Gerald. I'll remember this." And I meant every word. I should explain why that dinner didn't surprise me. By 28, I'd learned that my father's cruelty followed a pattern, predictable as the tide, twice as relentless. I was 7 the first time I understood I was different. I'd pressed my ear against my parents' bedroom door after hearing my mother cry, and I heard him call her a "look at that blonde hair," he spat. "Where did it come from, Diane?" "Certainly not from me." At 12, I wanted to join the school volleyball team. Gerald refused to sign the permission slip. "I'm not investing in someone else's kid," he told me, right in front of Marcus, who got new baseball cleat that same week. At 18, Marcus went to Boston University. Gerald paid every cent: tuition, housing, meal plans, spending money. When I got accepted to nursing school, he looked at me across the same dining table and said, "Your real father can pay for yours." So I took out loans. I worked double shifts at a diner. I graduated 6 years later with $60,000 in debt and a degree I'd earned without his help. The worst part wasn't the money or the missed opportunities. It was watching what his accusations did to my mother. Every argument they had, every disagreement about anything, bills, vacations, Marcus' career, somehow circled back to me. I was his weapon, his evidence, his constant reminder of her alleged betrayal. The night before I left for college, my grandmother Eleanor pulled me aside. "Keep every document from the hospital where you were born," she said, her grip firm on my wrist. Your birth certificate, any paperwork. I have a feeling we might need them someday. I didn't understand then, but I kept the papers. And 18 years later, I'd finally learned why she told me to. That night, I drove back to my apartment in Hartford, a small one-bedroom that I'd furnished with second-hand pieces and pure stubbornness. Nathan was waiting on the couch, his laptop open to floor plans for a client. A glass of wine poured for each of us. He knew immediately something was wrong. What did he do this time? I told him about the DNA form, the ultimatum, the 6-week deadline. Nathan's jaw tightened with every word. Maybe you should just do it, he said finally. Take the test, prove him wrong once and for all. Shut him up forever. I set down my wine glass. A cheap Target find, nothing like the Waterford crystal my father drank from, and looked at the modest diamond on my finger. Nathan had designed the ring himself, based on a sketch I'd drawn years ago in a journal. It's not about proving him wrong anymore, I said. It's about freeing my mother. Nathan went quiet. He knew the story I was about to tell. 5 years ago, I'd gotten a call from my grandmother at 2 a.m. She'd found my mother in the bathroom with an empty bottle of sleeping pills. The paramedics arrived in time, but just barely. Since then, Diane had been on antidepressants, seeing a therapist twice a week, building herself back piece by piece. Gerald never apologized. He never even acknowledged what his 23 years of accusations had done to her. He just kept insisting he was right. My mother gave that man 35 years of loyalty. I told Nathan complete faithfulness, and he repaid her with 28 years of calling her a liar. I picked up my phone and pulled up a local genetics lab I'd researched months ago. Gone Trust Independent certified, and most importantly, not connected to Gerald. I'll take the test, but I'll do it my way. 2 weeks later, Gerald turned 60. The party was held at the Fairfield Country Club. 18 holes of manicured green overlooking Long Island Sound, a private dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows, and 30 relatives gathered to celebrate the man who'd made my mother's life a prison. I wore a simple black dress. Nathan squeezed my hand as we walked in, whispering, 2 hours. We can survive 2 hours. We couldn't. Halfway through dinner, after 3 glasses of Chateau Margaux, Gerald stood up to give a speech. He thanked everyone for coming. He praised Marcus for his brilliant career in finance. He raised a glass to my mother for her patience. Then his eyes found me. I see my daughter is here tonight, he said, and the word daughter dripped with air quotes. A few relatives chuckled uncomfortably. I hope she's been thinking about our conversation, about proving where she really comes from. The room went quiet. Dad, Marcus said, half rising from his chair. Maybe this isn't the time. Gerald waved him off. No, this is exactly the time. Family should be honest with each other. He smiled at me. That cold reptilian smile I'd seen 1,000 times. You know what they call a bird that lays its eggs in another bird's nest? A cuckoo. The cuckoo's egg looks beautiful, doesn't it? But it doesn't belong. It never did. Somewhere behind me, an aunt gasped. A cousin snickered. My mother stared at her lap, tears dripping onto her Cartier bracelet, a gilt gift Gerald had given her after one of their worst fights. I picked up my fork, set it down again, and stood. Every eye in the room turned to me. Thank you for the reminder, Gerald, I said, my voice steady. I'll remember this. Then I turned to my mother. Mom, would you like to step outside for some air? She took my hand, and together we walked out of that room, past the whispers, past the stares, past the man who'd spent 28 years trying to destroy us both. But I wasn't done. Not even close. My grandmother caught up to us in the parking lot, her heels clicking against the asphalt like gunshots.
Tori, wait.
I turned. Ella Laner Whitmore was 78 years old with posture like a queen and eyes that missed nothing. She'd never liked Gerald. That man thinks he's God's gift to engineering. She told my mother before the wedding. But he's just a small man with a big ego. Now, she looked at me with something I'd never seen in her face before. Urgency. There's something I need to tell you, she said, glancing back to make sure Gerald hadn't followed. Something I should have told you years ago. She led us to a bench overlooking the golf course. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and my grandmother's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The night you were born," she said, "something strange happened at St. Mary's Hospital." I felt my mother stiffen beside me. "When the nurse brought you out to show me your grandfather was still alive, then we were both there." She looked terrified. Her hands were shaking. "She handed you to Diane too quickly, then practically ran out of the room." "Mom," Diane said, her voice cracking, "you never told me this." I tried to investigate. I called the hospital, asked questions. They stonewalled me, told me everything was normal, all records sealed for privacy. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. "But I made a copy of your birth record before they locked everything down." I looked at the document. Time of birth 11:47 p.m. I gave birth at 11:58. My mother said slowly. "I remember looking at the clock. I remember because the doctor made a joke about almost being a leap day baby. 11 minutes. Something had happened in those 11 minutes. There's a name," my grandmother said. "The head nurse that night, Margaret Sullivan. She retired 10 years ago. I have her address." The next morning, I walked into Gene Trust's Hartford office with 3 DNA samples. Mine was easy, a cheek swab sealed in a sterile tube. My mother's was voluntary. She'd given it to me the night before with tears in her eyes and steady hands. "Whatever this shows," she'd said, "you're my daughter. Nothing changes that." My father's was stolen. A few strands of hair plucked from the brush he kept in the guest bathroom. The one I'd used every Thanksgiving and Christmas for years, pretending I didn't notice the way he flinched when I reached past him for the soap. The technician at Gene Trust, a calm woman named Dr. Reyes, explained the process. "Results in 3 weeks, legally admissible if needed, complete confidentiality." I paid extra for expedited processing. My grandmother insisted on covering the cost. That afternoon, I tried calling Margaret Sullivan. The phone rang 6 times before someone picked up. A woman's voice, older, trembling slightly. "Hello, Mrs. Sullivan. My name is Tori Townsend. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. I believe you were the head nurse that night, and I can't help you." The words came fast, panicked. "Mrs. Sullivan, please, I just need to ask. I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't contact me again." Click. I stared at my phone for a long moment. Nathan looked up from his drafting table. "What happened?" She hung up on me. I set the phone down slowly, but not before she panicked. "She knows something, Nathan. She definitely knows something." An innocent woman would have been confused. Margaret Sullivan was terrified. Whatever happened that night in 1997, she'd been carrying it for 28 years. And now, so would I. 3 days later, the email arrived. Not to me directly. Gerald wasn't that subtle. He sent it to our entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, people I hadn't seen since childhood. 47 recipients. My mother, my grandmother, and I were all CC'd. The subject line read, "Regarding Tori's wedding." I read it in my car, parked outside the hospital where I worked, my hands trembling against the steering wheel. "Dear family, as many of you know, I have carried a burden for 28 years. I have endured doubt about my daughter's true parentage, and I have watched my wife refuse to admit the truth. I have asked Tori to take a DNA test and share the results with our family before her wedding. She has so far refused, which I believe speaks for itself. Until this matter is resolved publicly, I will not be attending the ceremony. I hope you will all understand my position." Attached as a family photograph from Tori's christening. I invite you to look closely and draw your own conclusions. Regards, Gerald Townsend. The attachment was a photo I remembered from my grandmother's mantle. Me at 3 months old, cradled in my mother's arms, blonde hair, blue eyes, pale skin, surrounded by Gerald, Marcus, and a dozen brunette relatives. Gerald had circled my face in red and added a caption, "Spot the difference." Within hours, the responses started flooding in. Some defended my mother. Most just asked questions, careful, probing, curious about the drama. Marcus called me that night. "Just do what Dad wants," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "You're making this worse. You're ruining his reputation." I laughed, actually laughed at that. His reputation? I repeated. That's what you're worried about? He hung up without answering. 3 weeks after I submitted the samples, the email from Gone Trust arrived at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Nathan was traveling for work, a project consultation in Boston that couldn't be rescheduled. I was alone in our apartment, a half-eaten salad on the coffee table, my laptop open to a streaming service I hadn't actually been watching. The subject line was clinical. Your DNA analysis results. Secure document. I enter my password. I verified my identity. I opened the PDF, and then I read it 3 times because the first 2 times the words didn't make sense. Subject A, Tori Townsend, shows 0% genetic match with Subject B, Gerald Townsend. I'd expected that. I'd prepared for it. Even steeled myself for the confirmation that Gerald was right about one thing, even if he was wrong about everything else. But then came the second line. Subject A, Tori Townsend, shows 0% genetic match with Subject C, Diane Townsend. I stopped breathing. 0%. Not my father's daughter. Not my mother's daughter. I called Gene Trust's after hours line, my voice cracking as I demanded to speak with someone, anyone who could explain this. A technician walked me through the results. No contamination, no errors, no possibility of a mistake. The samples were clear. The science was conclusive. I was not related to either of my parents, which meant my mother had never cheated. Gerald had been wrong about that for 28 years. But it also meant something else. Something impossible. If Diane Townsend didn't have an affair, if she'd been faithful like she'd always claimed, then how was I not her biological daughter? I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, my phone in my lap, staring at the ceiling. For 28 years, my father called my mother a cheater. For 28 years, he was wrong about the affair. But he was right about one thing. I wasn't his daughter. The question was, whose daughter was I? I drove to my parents' house the next morning, timing my arrival for 10 a.m. Late enough that Gerald would be at his golf game. Early enough that my mother would still be in her robe drinking Earl Grey in the sunroom. She looked up when I walked in, and her face immediately creased with concern. Tori, what's wrong? I sat down across from her and handed her my phone with the Gene Trust report on the screen. I watched her read it. I watched the color drain from her face. Watched her lips move silently as she read the numbers again and again. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wild. This is wrong, she whispered. This has to be wrong. I called the lab, triple-checked everything. There's no mistake, Mom. But I gave birth to you. Her voice rose, cracking on the edges. I was in labor for 14 hours. I felt you come out of my body. I saw you, Tori. You were red and screaming and mine. I took her hands in mine. They were ice cold. I believe you, I said. Which means there's only one explanation. Something happened at the hospital. Someone switched us. The silence stretched between us, like a wire about to snap. The time my mother said suddenly, the birth certificate says 11:47, but I remember I was watching the clock because the contractions were so bad. You were born at 11:58. I always wondered about that discrepancy. 11 minutes. 11 minutes. That changed 2 families forever. Mom, I said carefully. If I'm not your biological daughter, that means your real daughter is out there somewhere. 28 years old, living someone else's life. My mother started to cry. Not the silent tears Gerald always provoked, but deep shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal. We have to find her, she managed. We have to find them both. I need to pause here for a moment. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you didn't belong in your own family, like you were somehow wrong just for existing, I see you. This story isn't over. The truth is about to get a lot more complicated. If you're invested in finding out what happened at that hospital, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me your theories. Now, let me tell you about the nurse who finally broke her silence. Gerald found out about the DNA test before I could prepare. Marcus, always the obedient son, had seen the Gone Trust confirmation email on my mother's phone while visiting for lunch. Within an hour, my phone was ringing. So Gerald's voice was triumphant before I'd even said hello. What did it say? Was I right? I didn't answer. I couldn't figure out how to explain that he was right and wrong at the same time. My silence told him everything he needed to know. I knew it. He laughed. Actually laughed. A sound of pure vindication. 28 years, Tori. 28 years I've been telling everyone and no one believed me. But I was right. I was right all along. Gerald, does your mother know? Of course she knows. She's probably crying right now, trying to figure out how to spin this. I could hear him pacing, his excitement barely contained. I'm sending another email to everyone, this time with proof. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You're not my daughter. Your mother lied to me for almost 3 decades, and now everyone will know exactly what kind of woman Diane Townsend really is. He hung up before I could explain that Diane hadn't lied, that she'd been telling the truth all along, that the real story was something none of us had ever imagined. Within the hour, Gerald called my mother and told her to pack her bags. I want you out of my house by the end of the month, he said. I'm done with your lies. My grandmother drove over immediately to stay with her. When I arrived that evening, I found them both in the living room. My mother curled into the couch like a wounded animal, my grandmother standing guard like a silver-haired sentinel. He thinks he's won, I said quietly. My grandmother looked at me with those sharp, knowing eyes. Then, let's show him the rest of the story. The next 3 days were the hardest of my life. I considered canceling the wedding, not because of Gerald, but because I couldn't bear the thought of my mother's vindication being overshadowed by white tulle and champagne toasts. Nathan refused. We're getting married, he said, holding my face in his hands. Period. Your father's issues are not our issues. We don't postpone our life for his tantrum. But I couldn't move forward without the truth. And the truth was locked inside Margaret Sullivan's memory. I called her again and again, 5 times in 3 days. Each call going straight to voicemail. On the 6th try, I left a different message. Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Tori Townsend.
I know you remember that name.
I have DNA evidence, certified, legally admissible DNA evidence that proves a baby was switched at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. I'm not looking to blame you. I'm not looking to sue anyone. I just need to know who I am. I paused, steadying my breath. If you don't call me back, my next call will be to a lawyer. I'll subpoena the hospital records. I'll file a formal investigation, and whatever you've been hiding for 28 years will come out in the worst possible way. I waited 1 hour, 2. At 4:17 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thursday, 2:00 p.m. Riverside Diner, Bridgeport. Come alone. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I texted back. I'll be there. Whatever Margaret Sullivan had been carrying for 28 years, she was finally ready to let it go. The question was whether I was ready to hear it. Riverside Diner was the kind of place time forgot. Vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a jukebox that only played oldies, and coffee that had probably been brewing since the Reagan administration. Margaret Sullivan sat in the corner booth, her back to the wall. She was 72, smaller than I'd imagined, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and hands that trembled against her coffee cup. She looked up when I slid into the seat across from her. You look just like her, she said quietly. Linda, you're your biological mother. Same hair, same eyes. I felt my heart stutter. You know who my biological mother is? Margaret closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, they were wet. I've carried this for 28 years, she said. Every single day, wondering if I did the right thing by staying quiet, wondering if I should have spoken up when it happened. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn leather journal. Its pages yellowed with age. This is my shift log from March 15, 1997, the night you were born. She opened it to a flagged page and slid it across the table. I read her cramped handwriting, my blood running cold with every line. 11:47 p.m. Baby girl number 1. Born to Diane Townsend. Healthy 7 pounds 2 ounces. 11:58 p.m. Baby girl number 2. Born to Linda Morrison. Healthy 6B40. 12:32 a.m. Incident trainee nurse Carla Rise mixed up infants after bathing. Realized error at 2:15 a.m. Both families had already bonded. 2:45 a.m. Meeting with hospital administrator. Decision made to correct records, not families. Less traumatic for everyone. NDA required for all staff present. I looked up at Margaret, my hands shaking. They knew, I whispered. They knew that night, and they covered it up. The administrator said it would cause more harm to switch you back. Both mothers had already held their babies, fed them, named them. Margaret's voice cracked. I was 24 years old. They threatened my license, my pension. They made me sign a non-disclosure agreement. I had 2 kids of my own to feed. Who was the other baby? I asked. The one who went home with Linda Morrison. Margaret pulled out another piece of paper, a printout from a social media profile. A woman my age, brown hair, brown eyes, a smile that looked exactly like Marcus. Her name is Rachel Morrison. She's 28 years old. She lives in Springfield, Massachusetts. She looked at me with eyes full of decades of guilt. And she's your mother's biological daughter. That night, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open to Rachel Morrison's LinkedIn profile. Elementary school teacher at Springfield Public Schools, graduate of UMass Amherst, volunteer at the local animal shelter. Her profile picture showed a woman with chestnut brown hair and warm brown eyes standing in front of a classroom decorated with colorful alphabet letters. She looked exactly like what my brother Marcus might have looked like if he'd been born a woman. I composed the message 17 times before finally hitting send.
Rachel.
This is going to sound completely insane, and I apologize in advance. My name is Tori Townsend. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital in Bridgeport, Connecticut on March 15, 1997, the same night and place as you. I recently did a DNA test that showed I'm not biologically related to either of my parents. I've since spoken with a nurse who was working that night, and she confirmed that 2 babies were accidentally switched. I believe you're the biological daughter of Diane and Gerald Townsend. And I believe I'm the biological daughter of Linda Morrison. I have documentation. I have a witness statement. I'm not looking for anything from you. I just thought you deserved to know the truth. If you're willing to talk, please call me. I included my phone number and closed the laptop before I could second-guess this myself. 24 hours passed. I checked my phone every 10 minutes like a teenager waiting for a text back from a crush. Then, at 9:38 p.m. the following night, my phone rang. Is this Tori? The voice on the other end was shaky, uncertain, but something in it felt familiar. Rachel. A long pause. A shuddering breath. My whole life, people have told me I don't look like my parents. My dad, well, my legal dad, used to joke that maybe the hospital made a mistake. We all laughed about it. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I guess it wasn't a joke after all. We talked for 3 hours that night. By the end, we'd both agreed to take another DNA test. This one comparing Rachel to Gerald and Diane. The results would be ready in 10 days, just in time for my engagement party. Over the next week, I built my case like a prosecutor preparing for trial. First, the documents. I had my original Gone Trust report showing 0% match with both Gerald and Diane. I had Margaret Sullivan's handwritten shift log from 1997, which she'd finally agreed to let me photograph. I had a notarized statement from Margaret signed before a witness at her attorney's office. Her own decision, she said, to finally clear her conscience. The hospital threatened me for 28 years, she told me when I picked up the document. I'm 72 now. What are they going to do? Fire me from retirement? Second, the DNA. Rachel had submitted her samples to Gone Trust using the same expedited process I had. Her results comparing to Gerald and Diane would arrive 2 days before the engagement party. Third, the witnesses. My grandmother Ella Laner would be there, of course. She'd been waiting 28 years for this moment. Margaret Sullivan agreed to attend, sitting quietly in the corner until needed, and Rachel, my biological sister in spirit if not in genetics, would be waiting in the room next door. Are you sure about this? Nathan asked as we reviewed the plan together, confronting him publicly. There's no taking it back. I thought about my mother, about the bottle of sleeping pills, about 28 years of being called a liar, a cheater. He wanted a public reckoning, I said. He sent that email to 47 people. He called me a cuckoo's egg in front of the entire family. I straightened the stack of documents on my desk. He doesn't get to slink away privately now. Everyone who believed him needs to see the truth. Nathan nodded slowly. Then let's give them a show they'll never forget. 3 days before the engagement party, Rachel's DNA results arrived. Subject A, Rachel Morrison, shows 99.97% genetic match with Subject B, Gerald Townsend. Subject A, Rachel Morrison, shows 99.98% genetic match with Subject C, Diane Townsend. I read the numbers 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Then I called Rachel. Can you meet me tomorrow in person? We chose a Starbucks halfway between Hartford and Springfield, neutral ground for 2 women whose entire lives had just been rewritten by science. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 untouched lattes. When she saw me, she stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. She had brown hair, brown eyes, a strong jawline that I'd seen on Marcus 1,000 times, a subtle dimple on her left cheek, the same one Gerald had. And I had blonde hair, blue eyes, a button nose, and fair skin that matched the photos Margaret had shown me of Linda Morrison. We were strangers who should have been sisters. Sisters who were raised by the wrong families. This is so weird, Rachel whispered. Then she laughed. And I laughed. And suddenly we were hugging in the middle of a Starbucks, crying into each other's shoulders while the baristas pretended not to notice. I want to meet them, Rachel said when we finally pulled apart. Diane and Gerald, my biological parents. You will, I promised. In 3 days, I didn't tell her that one of those parents would be on his knees when she walked into the room. The engagement party was held at Whitmore Estate, my grandmother's family home, a Georgian manor with rose gardens and fairy lights strung through century-old oak trees. She'd insisted on hosting to give you a proper celebration in a place where Gerald's ego can't reach. 60 guests arrived that evening in cocktail attire. Aunts and uncles, cousins, family, friends, and every single person who'd received Gerald's accusatory email. I wore a navy blue Reformation dress and carried myself like a woman who had already won. Nathan stayed close, his hand on the small of my back, steady as always. My mother arrived with my grandmother, her eyes still red from days of crying, but her posture straighter than I'd seen in years. Something had shifted in her since we'd learned the truth, a weightlifting even before the public vindication. And then Gerald arrived. He came late, of course, fashionably late, as he'd call it, letting the crowd gather, letting the anticipation build. He wore a Tom Ford suit, his Rolex catching the chandelier light, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He thought this was his victory lap. He had no idea. I watched him work the room, shaking hands, accepting congratulations from relatives who believed his version of events. Such a difficult situation. I heard an aunt murmur to him, "You've been so patient." Marcus stood beside him, uncomfortable but compliant, the loyal soldier he'd always been. In the corner of the room, Margaret Sullivan sat quietly with a glass of water, her hands still trembling after all these years. And in the room next door, through a door that connected to the main hall, Rachel Morrison waited for her cue. I checked my phone. Nathan nodded. It was time. Halfway through the cocktail hour, Gerald asked for a microphone. The room quieted as he stepped onto the small raised platform my grandmother had set up for toasts. He cleared his throat, adjusted his jacket, and smiled at the crowd like a king addressing his subjects. "First, I'd like to congratulate Nathan," he began. "You're a brave man marrying into this complicated family." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. "But I think we all know why I'm really up here." Gerald's gaze found me in the crowd, and something cold flickered in his eyes. "There's been a lot of talk lately, a lot of speculation. I asked Tori to take a DNA test, and I know she did. What I don't know is why she's been hiding the results." The room went completely silent. So, I thought I'd help her out. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. My son was kind enough to share a copy of the report with me. Marcus had the decency to look ashamed at least. Gerald unfolded the paper with theatrical slowness. 0% genetic match with Gerald Townsend. 0% genetic match with Diane Townsend. Gasps echoed through the room. My mother gripped Eleanor's hand. 28 years. Gerald's voice rose with vindicated fury. 28 years I've been telling everyone that something wasn't right. And now the science proves it. He turned to my mother, his face contorted with decades of accumulated resentment. You lied to me, Diane. You lied to everyone. And now the whole family knows exactly what kind of woman you really are. The silence that followed was absolute. And then I started walking toward the stage. You're right, Gerald. My voice was calm as I stepped onto the platform and took the microphone from his hand.
He was so surprised you let me.
The DNA test shows I'm not your biological daughter, and I'm not Mom's biological daughter, either. Gerald's smirk widened. A few relatives exchanged knowing glances, but not because Mom had an affair. The smirk faltered. I turned to face the crowd. All 60 of them. Every person who'd received that email. Every relative who'd whispered about my mother for years. Let me introduce you to someone. I nodded toward the side door. Rachel stepped through. 28 years old. Brown hair, brown eyes, a jawline that was unmistakably, undeniably Towns. The room erupted in murmurs. Someone dropped a champagne glass. Marcus made a strangled sound. This is Rachel Morrison, I said. She was born 11 minutes before me at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. The night I was born, there was an accident. A trainee nurse mixed up 2 babies after bathing them, and the hospital covered it up to avoid a lawsuit. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. The wall-mounted display I'd arranged earlier flickered to life, showing the gene trust reports. Rachel's DNA shows a 99.97% match with Gerald Townsend, a 99.98% match with Diane Townsend. I let that sink in. She is your biological daughter, Gerald. The daughter you've been searching for, and she's been living in Massachusetts her entire life because a hospital made a mistake and chose to hide it. Gerald's face had gone white. He looked at Rachel, really looked at her, and I watched 28 years of certainty crumble. This is Margaret Sullivan, I continued as Margaret rose from her corner seat. She was the head nurse that night. She has a notarized statement confirming everything I've just told you. The shift logs, the hospital cover-up, all of it. Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaky but clear. Mr. Townsend, I was there. I watched it happen. Your wife never betrayed you. Never. The hospital made us all sign NDAs. They threatened our jobs, our pensions. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I turned back to Gerald, whose hands were now gripping the edge of the platform like a man trying not to drown. You wanted science, Gerald. Here it is. Every document, every signature, every 11 minutes that changed 2 families forever. At that moment, standing on that stage with Rachel beside me, I felt something I'd never felt in 28 years. Vindication. Not for myself, but for my mother. For every tear she'd cried, every accusation she'd swallowed, every sleepless night spent wondering if her own husband would ever believe her. If this story is resonating with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the truth takes decades to surface. Now, let me tell you what happened when Gerald finally understood what he'd done. Gerald Townsend had spent 28 years being certain. Certain that his wife had betrayed him. Certain that his daughter was proof of her infidelity. Certain that his suspicion made him righteous. That his cruelty was justified. That science would eventually vindicate him. Now science had spoken, and it had destroyed every foundation he'd built his identity on. He looked at Rachel, this stranger with his jawline, his eyes, his blood, and something in him shattered. He looked at the DNA results on the screen, the numbers that proved him right about my parentage, but catastrophically wrong about everything else. He looked at Margaret Sullivan, whose trembling testimony had just demolished 28 years of accusations, and then his knees buckled. Gerald Townsend, proud, arrogant, certain Gerald Townsend, collapsed onto the platform like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He caught himself on one knee, his hands slapping against the hardwood floor, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. I didn't know, he whispered. How could I have known?
How?
You could have trusted her. My voice was quiet, but carried through the silent room. You could have investigated. You could have looked for other explanations instead of assuming the worst about the woman who loved you. But the hair, the eyes, genetics are complicated. Recessive genes exist. Hospital mistakes happen. I stepped closer, looking down at the man who had made my childhood a battlefield. But you chose suspicion. You chose cruelty. For 28 years, you punished Mom and me for a crime that never happened. From across the room, I heard a chair scraped back. Marcus, silent, compliant, Marcus stood up. For a moment, I thought he would come to his father's defense like he always had. Instead, he walked past Gerald without a glance and crossed to our mother's side.
Mom.
His voice cracked.
I'm sorry.
I should have said something years ago. I should have. Diane pulled him into a hug, her tears soaking into his shoulder. And Gerald remained on his knees, watching his family choose each other over him. For 28 years, my mother had lived in Gerald Townsend's shadow. She had endured his accusations at breakfast and dinner, and every moment in between. She had cried herself to sleep more nights than anyone knew. She had swallowed his cruelty like medicine, telling herself that maybe someday he would see the truth. Now the truth was everywhere on screens and documents in the face of a stranger who carried her blood. Diane stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The crowd parted for her. Even Marcus stepped aside. She stopped in front of Gerald, who was still on one knee, his face wet with tears. I'd never seen him cry before. 28 years, Gerald. Her voice was steady, stronger than I'd ever heard it. 28 years. I stayed because I loved you. Because I believed that someday you would trust me. Because I thought our family was worth fighting for. Gerald looked up at her. Diane, she raised her hand, cutting him off. Not yet. You don't get to apologize yet. The room held its breath. You owe me an apology in front of every person who received that email. You owe Tori an apology for every birthday you ruined, every graduation you ignored, every moment you made her feel like she didn't belong in her own family. She gestured toward Rachel, who stood frozen near the door. And you owe Rachel an apology for being the father she deserved, but never had. Gerald's shoulders shook with sobs I hadn't known he was capable of. I didn't need the world to believe me, Gerald. My mother's voice cracked on the last word. I needed you to believe me, and you never did. She turned her back on him and walked to where Rachel stood. Hello, she said softly, tears streaming down her face. I'm your mother. I'm so sorry it took so long to find you. It took Gerald 3 attempts to stand. Marcus didn't help him. Neither did I. Neither did anyone in that room full of relatives who had until 10 minutes ago believed his version of events. He gripped the edge of the platform, pulled himself upright, and reached for the microphone I'd set down. His voice, when he spoke, was barely recognizable. Hoarse, broken, stripped of every ounce of the arrogance I'd known my entire life. I was wrong. 3 words. 28 years overdue.
I was wrong about Diane.
She never. His voice cracked. He tried again. She never betrayed me. I accused her for nearly 3 decades. And I was wrong. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something other than suspicion in his eyes. Tori, I took things from you that I can never give back. Your childhood, your trust, money that should have been yours. He swallowed hard. I'll repay your student loans, all of them. It's not enough, but it's a start. Then he turned to Rachel, this stranger, who was his daughter. This woman he'd never held, never known, never had the chance to disappoint. I don't know what to say to you. You're my daughter, and I've missed everything. Your first steps, your graduations, your entire life. His voice shattered on the words. That's something I'll regret until the day I die. Rachel was crying too. We all were at this point. But her voice was steady. We can start now, she said, if you're willing to actually be a father instead of a judge. Gerald nodded, unable to speak. My grandmother stepped forward and handed him a tissue from her purse. Clean yourself up, Gerald, she said, not unkindly. You have a lot of work ahead of you. 1 week after the engagement party, I drove to Springfield, Massachusetts. The house was a modest colonial in a quiet suburb. White siding, blue shutters, a garden of wild flowers that had clearly been someone's labor of love. A far cry from my grandmother's estate or Gerald's Tudor mansion, but warm in a way those houses had never quite managed. Linda Morrison answered the door before I could knock. She was 56 years old, with blonde hair streaked with silver and blue eyes that were an exact mirror of my own. Looking at her was like looking into a time machine. This was who I would become in 30 years.
Tori.
Her voice caught on my name. I've been staring at your picture all week. I kept thinking I was dreaming. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender and something else I couldn't identify. Something that felt impossibly like home. We sat in her kitchen for 4 hours. She showed me photographs of her childhood, of my biological grandparents who had passed away years ago, of the life I might have had if a trainee nurse hadn't made a mistake. She told me about her ex-husband, David, my biological father, who had died of cancer 3 years ago, never knowing that Rachel wasn't his. He used to joke that Rachel had old soul eyes, Linda said, wiping her tears with a kitchen towel. Now I understand. They were your eyes, Tori. They were always your eyes. I showed her pictures of my childhood, too. The blonde baby in a house full of brunettes. The girl who never quite fit. The woman who had finally found out why. I don't want to replace Diane, Linda said. She raised you. She's your mother. She is, I agreed. But maybe there's room for one more. Linda's smile could have lit the entire house. I'd like that, she said. I'd like that very much. 2 months later, I married Nathan Miller in the rose garden of Whitmore Estate, surrounded by fairy lights and family, both the one I was born into and the one I was raised by. My mother walked me down the aisle. Not Gerald. My mother. She wore a champagne-colored dress and held her head high, her step steady for the first time in decades. Beside her, I wore a Vera Wang gown that she and my grandmother had insisted on buying for me. A proper wedding dress for a proper wedding, Eleanor had declared. Gerald sat in the second row, quiet and diminished. He didn't protest when I told him he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. He didn't argue when I explained that this was my mother's moment, not his. He just nodded and said, I understand. It was a start. Rachel stood with my bridesmaids, wearing a deep green dress that brought out the brown in her eyes. Our mother's eyes, Gerald's eyes. She'd met the towns properly in the weeks after the party. Tentative lunches and careful conversations that were slowly building towards something like a relationship. Linda Morrison sat in the front row of the guest section, a place of honor. She waved when she caught my eye, her own eyes shining with tears. My grandmother rose to give a toast. This wedding is not just about 2 people, Eleanor said, raising her champagne glass. It's about 2 families finally finding their way back to the truth. It's about a daughter who refused to accept a lie and a mother who waited 28 years to be believed. She looked at me, then at Rachel, then at Diane. To truth, she said, however long it takes. To truth, the room echoed, and I drank to that. The lawsuit took 8 months. Rachel and I filed jointly against St. Mary's Hospital, represented by a medical malpractice attorney my grandmother had found, a woman who specialized in wrongful birth cases and had, she told us with a thin smile, a particular interest in institutions that think they can cover up their mistakes. Margaret Sullivan testified, her notarized statement backed by the original shift log she'd kept hidden for 28 years. The hospital's lawyers tried to discredit her, citing her age, her NDA, her delayed disclosure. It didn't work. Internal documents surfaced during discovery. Emails between hospital administrators discussing the incident. Memos about risk mitigation, a budget line item labeled potential liability settlement that had been quietly renewed every year since 1997. They'd known. They'd always known. And they'd spent nearly 3 decades praying no one would find out. In the end, the hospital chose to settle rather than face a jury. $450,000 to each family for a total of $900,000, a public apology printed in the local paper, mandatory improvements to their newborn identification protocols, and the resignation of the administrator who had ordered the cover-up, long since retired, but now publicly named. We didn't sue for revenge, I told a reporter who showed up at the courthouse steps. We sued so no other family would spend 28 years living a lie that a hospital could have corrected in one day. Margaret Sullivan was granted immunity from any personal liability in exchange for her cooperation. She sent me a card afterward, her handwriting shaky but clear. Thank you for giving me a reason to finally tell the truth.
I can sleep now.
I kept it in a drawer with my birth certificate. The real one. The one that said 11:58 p.m. The one that told the truth. 6 months after the wedding, Gerald invited me to dinner. Just the two of us. He'd chosen a quiet Italian restaurant in downtown Hartford. Not the country club, not anywhere flashy, just a corner booth with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. He looked older than he had at my engagement party. Grayer, smaller somehow, as if the weight of his confession had physically diminished him. I wanted to thank you, he said after we'd ordered for agreeing to see me. You're not my biological father, I said. You never were, but you did raise me, even if you did it badly. He flinched at that, but nodded. I'm in therapy now, he said. Diane insisted. Well, suggested strongly. We're doing couples counseling, too. We've been separated, but we're trying to. He trailed off, searching for words. We're trying to find out if there's anything left to save. I thought about my mother, about the way she'd stood in front of him at the party, demanding the apology she deserved for decades, about the strength it must have taken to consider rebuilding after everything he'd put her through. I remember when you taught me to ride a bike, I said. I was 5 before you knew about before you decided I wasn't yours. You held the seat and ran beside me for an hour until I got it. Gerald's eyes filled with tears. I remember, he whispered. That's the father I needed, I said. The one who held on. I'm willing to try, Gerald. But I need you to understand. Forgiveness is a process, not an event. And you have a lot of work to do. He nodded. I know, and I'll do it. However long it takes. I didn't forgive him that night. I'm not sure I've fully forgiven him yet, but I chose to give him the chance my mother never got, the chance to prove he could change. Rachel and Marcus met properly for the first time at a family dinner a month after the wedding. It was awkward at first. How do you make small talk with the sibling you should have grown up with, the brother who got the childhood that should have been yours? But then Marcus mentioned he was allergic to shellfish. Wait, Rachel said. Me too. Since birth, the doctor said it was genetic. What about being left-handed? Marcus asked. Rachel held up her left hand. No way. Marcus laughed. A real laugh, surprised and delighted. What about music? What bands do you listen to? 30 minutes later, they discovered that they both loved an obscure indie folk band that nobody else in either family had ever heard of. Both hated cilantro with an inexplicable passion. And both had a habit of tapping their right foot when they were thinking. This is so weird, Marcus said, shaking his head. You're like a mirror, but you know, a girl version. I was going to say shorter. Rachel threw a bread roll at him, and for the first time in my memory, a Towns and family dinner had genuine laughter. Not the polite, strained kind that my mother had always worked so hard to manufacture, but real laughter, the kind that comes from people who are actually happy to be together. It was a small moment, but it felt like the beginning of something new. 3 months after the wedding, Diane and Linda met for lunch. I wasn't there, but my mother told me about it afterward, her voice soft with wonder. They'd chosen a cafe halfway between their houses, neutral ground, as Rachel and I had done months earlier. Linda had brought photos of Rachel's childhood. Diane had brought photos of mine. They'd sat there for 3 hours trading stories about daughters they'd raised but hadn't birthed. She told me about Rachel's first words, Diane said. And I told her about yours. We both cried a lot. Was it strange? I asked. Meeting the woman who raised your biological daughter. My mother considered the question for a long moment. I thought it would be, she admitted. I thought I'd feel, I don't know, jealous, resentful. But when I looked at her, all I could think was she loved Rachel the same way I loved you, completely without question. She reached across the table and took my hand.
We lost 28 years, she said.
But we gained each other, and we gained the truth. That has to count for something. Linda and Diane have lunch together once a month now. They've become friends, an unlikely friendship born from shared loss and unexpected connection. They call each other the other mother. And, in a strange way, I think it's helped them both heal. I'm sitting in our new apartment now, a 2-bedroom in a nicer part of Hartford with room for Nathan's home office and space for the nursery we'll need soon. The walls are covered with photographs. My wedding day with my mother on one side, and Linda Morrison on the other. Rachel and me at Thanksgiving, our first holiday together. My grandmother Eleanor looking triumphant at her birthday party last month. Nathan is in the kitchen making dinner. Something complicated with too many ingredients. He's been on a cooking kick lately. I've been thinking a lot about the past year, about identity and family, and what it means to belong. For 28 years, I tried to prove I was a Townsend. I straightened my blonde hair to look darker. I learned to golf because Gerald loved golf. I studied nursing instead of art because it was practical, reliable, not something a cuckoo's egg would choose. I spent my whole life trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. Now I know I was never supposed to fit. I was someone else's daughter, living someone else's life, carrying someone else's DNA. But here's what I've learned. DNA doesn't make a family. The woman who held my hand during nightmares, who taught me to read, who stayed married to a man who tortured her just to keep our family together. That's my mother, not biology.
Love.
Nathan walks in with 2 plates and a knowing smile. You're doing that thing again, he says. The deep thinking while staring at nothing thing. I laugh and take the plate he offers. On the coffee table, tucked between a stack of baby-named books and a pregnancy journal, is the test I took this morning. Positive. I don't know whose DNA this baby will carry. Mine, Nathan's, some echo of the Morrisons or the Townsends, but I know one thing for certain. This child will know they're loved from the very first moment, without condition, without doubt. That's the only proof that matters. If you're watching this and you've ever been accused of something you didn't do by a parent, a partner, anyone who should have trusted you, I want you to know the truth has a way of surfacing. Sometimes it takes 28 years. Sometimes it takes a DNA test and a brave nurse with a guilty conscience, but it surfaces. Don't let anyone's suspicion define your worth. And if you're the one doing the accusing, ask yourself, is my certainty worth destroying the people I love? My father spent 28 years being certain. He was certain my mother cheated. He was certain I wasn't his.